Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Quick question. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's step back in time to a day of celebration that turned into horror. This is the story of a wedding, a family, and a cook who changed everything. Wedding Day. Horror. How a slave cook poisoned a family in cold blood. The morning air hung heavy with the scent of dew and promise, yet beneath the gilded facades of the plantation, tension simmered like coals beneath ash. The McAllister estate, a sprawling stretch of oak and magnolia, stood proudly on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. Its walls gleamed white in the early sunlight, a testament to wealth carved from the toil of countless hands that would never touch the comforts they created. Today, however, would not be a day of celebration for everyone. Today was a day that would stain the history of that household with a darkness few could have imagined. Inside the bustling kitchen, smoke and heat twisted through the air. Copper pots clanged against iron, and the scent of spiced meats sweetened. Pastries and simmering sauces wove through the wooden beams like invisible threads of anticipation. Hannah, the cook, moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in these corridors, her hands slick with flour and her eyes sharp, catching every movement. She had seen weddings before, watched the laughter of masters, and carried out the orders that brought joy to those whose lives rested upon the labor of hers. But today, something deep inside her had shifted. It was not just duty or habit driving her movements. Today, it was a meticulously calculated resolve. Hannah had lived most of her life in the shadow of privilege she would never know. Her body and soul had been leased to work, her thoughts often dismissed as insignificant. But for years, she had watched cruelty in small doses, a whip across a back for a minor misstep, a word of derision over a burnt crust, the quiet humiliation of bearing the weight of unearned blame. And in those years, the seed of vengeance had taken root. It had grown quietly, nourished by the memories of injustice, and now it had matured into a chilling resolve. The family she served, the McAllisters, was the embodiment of the world that had denied her freedom. Colonel James McAllister, the patriarch, was a stern man with a booming voice and a gaze that could freeze the very marrow of a person. His wife, Margaret, had the delicate appearance of gentility, but her sweetness did not extend beyond the walls of her home. Their children, unaware of the world beyond privilege, ran through the halls, laughing in ignorance of the suffering that surrounded them. And now, their eldest son was to be wed to the daughter of a neighboring plantation owner, a celebration that would bring together the wealth and power of Charleston in a glittering display. As Hannah kneaded dough for the wedding feast, her mind was a battleground of memories and intentions. She thought of the way she had been called lazy for a slip of the hand, the bruises on her arms from the cane, the nights spent in the cold quarters while the McAllisters dined and slept warm. Her heart ached with the weight of years spent. Invisible, yet her hands did not tremble. They moved with precision, each motion measured, every action leading toward a singular purpose. By midday, the mansion was alive with the sounds of celebration. The McAllisters' friends and relatives had begun arriving, carriages crunching along the gravel, horses neighing in anticipation. Women in silk and lace fanned themselves, men in tailored coats exchanged polite greetings, and children scampered, in dresses and breeches that smelled faintly of perfume and dust. The estate sparkled with the promise of joy, yet within the kitchen a different kind of anticipation thickened the air. Hannah moved through her tasks, placing dishes, checking sauces, and tasting subtly, but not too much. Her actions were indistinguishable from her usual precision, yet hidden within the folds of the wedding feast was a dark secret, a slow-acting poison she had extracted with care from herbs and substances that could pass unnoticed in such a grand banquet. The first course was laid out with a flourish. Silver trays gleamed beneath sunlight streaming through the windows, and the smell of roasted meats and sugared fruits promised indulgence. Laughter rang through the halls as guests took their seats, and Hannah, carrying another platter, felt a cold calm settle over her. She had worked silently for months, learning the habits of the household, studying the timing of meals, the distribution of dishes, and the subtle preferences of each family member. Every choice had been deliberate, every movement intentional. When the first bite was taken, no one suspected a thing. The dishes were impeccable, the flavors familiar, the textures comforting. Guests complimented the chef. Hannah's name whispered in awe through polite conversation, and she smiled politely, hiding the storm inside her chest. As the meal progressed, more plates were served. Each one carried the faint, deadly trace of her calculated work. And as glasses clinked and voices rose in joyous celebration, the poison began its quiet, merciless work. It started subtly. A cough here, a slight pallor there, dismissed by the family as fatigue or perhaps the warmth of the day. Margaret McAllister excused herself, claiming a headache, while Colonel McAllister waved off a sudden dizziness with the confident shrug of a man unaccustomed to weakness. But within the hour, the symptoms multiplied. The children began to complain of nausea, their laughter replaced by discomfort. Guests whispered among themselves, confusion mounting as the invisible killer claimed more ground with each passing moment. And in the midst of it all, Hannah stood in the kitchen, watching, her heart beating not with fear, but with a grim satisfaction. She had imagined this day countless times, rehearsing every detail, calculating the precise moment when chaos would erupt. And now, as the laughter faded into gasps and the clinking of silverware gave way to cries of distress, she witnessed the first true signs of her plan unfolding. The McAllisters' power, their wealth, their unchallenged authority, crumbled quietly, invisibly, in the very room where they had always felt untouchable. As the mid-afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the McAllister estate, the grandeur of the wedding hall began to waver under a growing shadow of unease. Guests, once radiant in silk and lace, now moved with a hesitant, faltering energy. Conversations that had bubbled over glasses of wine and silver platters of delicacies were replaced by puzzled murmurs. One by one, faces twisted in confusion, hands flew to mouths in sudden nausea, and the first tentative cries of alarm broke the air. It was subtle at first, as though the air itself had shifted, and yet within moments, the festivity teetered on the edge of chaos. Colonel James McAllister, once imposing and unshakable, sat rigidly at the head of the long dining table. His jaw, set with pride moments earlier, now trembled slightly as he felt a dizziness that stole his equilibrium. His wide, commanding eyes darted around the hall, searching for reason, yet finding none. The laughter of children had been replaced with tears and plaintive complaints, the kind that tugged cruelly at a parent's heart, and Margaret, his wife, pressed a trembling hand to her temple, her composure cracking for the first time. Hannah remained in the kitchen, her movements quiet, careful, almost invisible, yet her gaze, steady and unwavering, tracked every subtle reaction of the family she had long served. Each moment was confirmation. The plan she had nurtured, measured, and executed with painstaking precision was working. She could almost feel the tension rise like smoke curling through the beams above. There was no malice in her expression, no gloating in her stance. Instead, there was an unsettling calm, a sense of inevitability, the feeling that justice, slow and sweet, was finally being served in the form of discomfort that no wealth, no power could stave off. By mid-afternoon, the initial confusion had grown into full-blown panic. Guests were leaving their seats, some rushing to the nearest windows for air, others clutching their stomachs, moaning in agony. Servants scurried, unsure of what was happening, their own fear amplifying the chaos. Hannah had anticipated this. She had accounted for every reaction, every question, every desperate attempt to understand what had gone wrong. The household, which had always relied on order, hierarchy, and obedience, was now descending into a strange, frightening disorder that not even Colonel McAllister's commanding voice could control. The poison moved silently, invisibly, like a shadow gliding along the edges of light. It was not immediate death, but a slow, relentless assault on the body, leaving the victims aware of every creeping horror. Margaret McAllister sank into her chair, shivering, her hands clutched at her chest, tears welling in her eyes. She had been proud of the event, proud of the marriage of her eldest son, proud of the elegance of her home, and now, the very celebration she had orchestrated was unraveling, a grotesque parody of the joy she had anticipated. Her eyes met Hannah's fleetingly, a momentary recognition of the invisible hand that had upended her world. But she could not yet articulate it, could not yet see the figure who had long worked silently at her side. The children were the next to succumb, their small bodies trembling as nausea gripped them. Screams of discomfort and confusion echoed through the hall, blending with the moans of the adults. Some guests fell to their knees, clutching at their stomachs, seeking relief that would not come. The music, which had once filled the hall with jubilant celebration, was drowned out by the sounds of distress. This was not the scene anyone had expected on such a day. It was a nightmare draped in the trappings of joy, and at the center of it all was the quiet, unassuming figure of the cook who had labored unnoticed for years. Hannah moved from one side of the kitchen to the other, fetching water and herbs, ostensibly to assist, yet careful not to draw suspicion. Every action was deliberate, every gesture calculated to maintain the illusion of duty while the poison did its work. She had prepared herself for the possibility of discovery, had rehearsed explanations, had memorized plausible deniability for any question that might arise. But as she watched the guests stumble, clutching one another, her chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange, bitter satisfaction. Each twitch of discomfort, each gasp of disbelief, was a testament to the years of suffering she had endured in silence. Outside the hall, the sun climbed higher, unaware of the turmoil inside. Carriages rolled slowly down the long drive, oblivious to the cries spilling from the mansion, oblivious to the dark reverberations that would echo through the memory of Charleston's social circles for decades to come. Inside, the McAllisters. Pride and power eroded minute by minute. Colonel McAllister, whose presence had once dominated the room, now slumped forward in his chair, beads of sweat forming on his brow. His voice, once a commanding thunder, had become weak and uncertain, cracking under the weight of the sudden affliction. By late afternoon, it was clear that the poison had struck the entire family. One by one, they succumbed to its effects. Margaret, trembling and pale, could barely call out to her husband or children. The eldest son, newly wed and seated with a smile at the start of the day, now doubled over in agony beside his bride, whose eyes widened in panic. Even the servants who had touched the food or assisted in serving were not spared, though in lesser measure, the poison had been measured carefully to ensure the devastation of the McAllister family without drawing immediate suspicion to the kitchen staff. Through it all, Hannah remained composed, her heart steady. She had waited years for a moment like this, for the opportunity to enact revenge in a way that was thorough, precise, and irreversible. And now, as the screams and cries filled the hall, she felt the weight of years of humiliation, pain, and invisibility lift ever so slightly. The power dynamic that had governed her life, the one that had dictated every movement, every word, every breath, was shifting irrevocably. In this moment, she held authority in a way she had never known. the authority to strike without warning, to reshape reality through patience, cunning, and understanding. Hannah's mind wandered briefly to the moral weight of her actions. There was no joy in the suffering itself, no cruel pleasure in watching the privileged falter. Instead, there was a solemn sense of balance, a reckoning that had been long delayed. She had labored and suffered under their command, invisible, dismissed, disrespected, and yet today, she was the arbiter of fate. Each gasp, each collapse was a statement of power long denied, a whisper of justice delivered in silence. As the last rays of sun crept across the polished floors of the McAllister Hall, the wedding celebration lay in ruins. What had begun as an event of joy, pomp, and family pride had transformed into a tableau of horror and despair. Hannah, still in her apron, still with her hands dusted with flour, observed the aftermath with the quiet detachment of someone who had acted out of necessity, who had endured and survived, and who had now orchestrated a moment that would forever alter the history of the household. The guests who remained whispered amongst themselves, confusion and fear mixing with disbelief. They did not know who to blame, could not yet see the invisible hand that had upended their world, and would never suspect that the quiet, loyal cook had carried out the act with precision, patience, and an intimate knowledge of every weakness, every routine, every trust placed in her. The evening shadows crept across the McAllister estate as the aftermath of the wedding feast settled like a dense fog. The once bright hallways, echoing with laughter only hours earlier, were now thick with fear, confusion, and whispered questions. Outside, the evening air carried the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen hearth, mingled with the sweet tang of burnt sugar and herbs, the lingering evidence of Hannah's careful preparations. Though the guests had largely fled in panic, a few lingered, desperate for explanations that could not yet be found. Colonel McAllister leaned against a carved wooden pillar, his face ashen, his chest rising and falling with ragged, uncertain breaths. His pride, which had always been as immovable as the oaks lining the estate, had cracked, splintered by forces invisible and unknowable. He called for his family, his voice faltering despite its former power, and Margaret, pale and trembling, tried to respond, her hands still clutching at her stomach. Their son, newly wed and pale as the white linens now smeared with traces of sickness, held his bride close, shielding her from the horror that had descended upon them. For the first time, the McAllisters' wealth and status offered no protection. Their authority, built over generations, was powerless against the quiet, invisible act of rebellion that had been orchestrated under their very noses. Hannah remained in the shadows of the kitchen, her hands washed, her apron neatly folded, her face composed. The chaos in the hall did not startle her. It had been anticipated, calculated down to the smallest detail. Yet she allowed herself a moment to reflect, not with pride nor malice, but with the weighty knowledge of years lived in invisibility and oppression. Every humiliation, every lash, every word that had sought to diminish her had brought her, here, to a moment where she held control in a way she had never known. It was a bitter justice, not sweet vengeance, but it was hers nonetheless. News of the horror spread rapidly through Charleston and its surrounding plantations. By the next morning, whispers had become a cacophony, and the streets were alive with speculation, gossip, and fear. The McAllisters' neighbors, once cordial in polite smiles and nods across fences, now crossed themselves in anxiety, wondering who could have committed such an act. Questions circulated. Was it a disease? Had the food simply spoiled? Some murmured about curses, divine punishment, or the reckoning of a family long steeped in pride. Yet none suspected that the quiet, diligent cook who had served the household for years had become the architect of this calamity. Authorities arrived. In the aftermath, summoned by frantic messages and desperate appeals from those still able to speak. Charleston's doctors, unaccustomed to witnessing a household decimated by what appeared to be sudden illness, examined the family members and the remaining guests. Symptoms aligned with neither known epidemic nor accident. Bodies shivered in feverish distress, stomachs heaved, and the doctors could do little more than observe and offer palliative care. In the absence of an immediate explanation, fear spread faster than the poison had. Fear of the unknown, fear of the invisible hand capable of bringing even the most powerful to their knees. Hannah's life, once constrained by the rigid boundaries of servitude, had shifted in profound ways. In the days following the disaster, she moved through the estate with the same diligence, the same quiet efficiency. Yet her perception of the world had changed. She observed now, with an acute awareness of power and its fragility. The McAllisters had controlled every detail of her life, her labor, her meals, her punishments, her words, and yet, in a single act executed with patience and knowledge, she had demonstrated that authority was not absolute. The realization was intoxicating, though she did not allow herself to revel in it publicly. She understood the danger of discovery, the fragility of her position, and the lethal consequences if suspicion fell upon her too soon. The community, meanwhile, began to piece together fragments of the story. Guests who had survived whispered of the mysterious illness, of the suddenness with which it struck, of the eerie precision with which it spared some while afflicting others. Local newspapers, printed in timid black ink, hinted at calamity at the McAllister estate without revealing details that might inflame public panic. The event became fodder for speculation. Some claimed a rival family had sought revenge, others suggested divine retribution for perceived sins. And through it all, Hannah remained a shadow in the background, invisible, unexamined, yet profoundly present in the outcome. Despite her careful planning, Hannah was not immune to the emotional weight of her actions. Alone in the quiet of the kitchen, she wrestled with the paradox of her position. The satisfaction of long-denied justice mingled uneasily with sorrow and horror at the suffering she had caused. She had not acted in malice for its own sake, nor for personal gain. Her act had been precise, measured, and meant to correct, in some small, terrible way, the imbalance of power that had governed her life. Yet she could not ignore the cries, the panic, the feverish faces she had left in her wake. The weight of consequence, though anticipated, was heavier than even she had imagined. Colonel McAllister's household was irrevocably changed. Family members recovered in varying degrees, some slowly, some never fully. The once proud patriarch now moved with a subdued caution, his commanding voice tempered by the memory of vulnerability. Margaret McAllister's grace was permanently tinged with wariness, her smiles more restrained, her movements measured, as though always expecting the invisible hand of chaos to strike again. Their son and his bride, who had entered marriage with confidence and hope, were forever marked by the memory of the day that should have been the pinnacle of joy. As weeks passed, the estate carried a haunted quiet. The echo of the wedding horror lingered like a shadow over halls that had once been filled with laughter and music. Hannah continued her work, performing duties with precision, yet she was no longer merely a servant. In the quiet moments between tasks, she contemplated the nature of power, justice, and invisibility. She had acted in a way that few could imagine, changing the course of a family's story with knowledge, patience, and courage born from suffering. The moral weight of her actions was a heavy cloak, yet she wore it with the awareness that sometimes justice is delivered in ways society refuses to acknowledge. The story of the McAllister disaster spread slowly but inexorably through the surrounding plantations, whispered by guests, servants, and neighbors. It became a cautionary tale about the fragility of status, the unseen forces of consequence, and the power of those rendered invisible to alter reality in profound ways. Even years later, the event was remembered not merely for the suffering it caused, but for the unsettling question it posed. Who holds true power, and how easily can the mighty fall when their oversight is flawed, their trust misplaced? Hannah, meanwhile, became both legend and enigma. To the McAllisters, she was indispensable, her skill unmatched, her loyalty unquestioned. To the wider community, she was a mystery, a figure who had been at the center of a calamity, yet emerged unscathed, her role invisible to those who sought explanations in conventional terms. And to herself, she was a quiet executor of justice, a survivor, a woman who had claimed a measure of control in a world that had long denied her agency. Months had passed since that fateful wedding day, yet the McAllister estate remained a place shadowed by memory. The once proud mansion, with its gleaming white walls and sprawling gardens, seemed quieter now, as though the house itself had absorbed the horror that had unfolded within. The laughter that had once filled its halls was replaced by careful footsteps, hushed tones, and a constant lingering unease. Even the servants, who had endured hardship and discipline as a matter of daily life, moved with a wary awareness, their glances often flicking toward the kitchen, where Hannah continued her work with a calm and steady hand. Hannah had returned to her routine, performing her tasks with the same meticulous attention that had always been her hallmark. Yet beneath the surface, she was changed. The act she had carried out, precise, calculated, and executed with patience, had transformed her understanding of herself and the world. No longer simply a servant, she now understood the fragility of authority and the power of knowledge wielded carefully. The memory of the cries, the gasps, the sudden collapse of the household's pride haunted her in quiet moments, yet she did not regret the justice she had delivered. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a reckoning long delayed, a statement to a world that had consistently denied her humanity. The McAllisters themselves were irrevocably altered. Colonel James McAllister, once commanding and indomitable, now moved with caution, his voice tempered and measured, his confidence permanently diminished. The fear that had gripped him on that day never fully lifted, and the rigid authority he had wielded so effortlessly now seemed fragile, prone to unravel at the faintest hint of disorder. Margaret McAllister, whose grace and composure had been the model of Charleston society, became quieter, her smiles restrained, her movements deliberate. She carried the memory of that day like a scar, a constant reminder of how swiftly the veneer of control could shatter. Their son, newly married and once full of hope, now approached life with a cautious wariness, his bride at his side, both carrying the memory of terror that had struck on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The family dinners that followed were quiet, subdued affairs, the laughter and exuberance of the past replaced by careful conversation and guarded expressions. Guests who visited spoke in hushed tones of the McAllister estate, recounting the story with a mixture of fear and fascination. The tale of the wedding that had turned to horror became a legend in Charleston, a story whispered from one generation to the next, a warning about the fragility of pride and the unseen power of those who labored unseen. For Hannah, the world had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Though she remained in the kitchen, continuing her work as if nothing had changed, she now carried with her a deep understanding of her own agency. The invisible years of labor, the constant demands, the endless suffering, these had forged a careful intelligence, a patient strategy, and a resolute will. On that wedding day, she had exercised that will fully, creating a moment that would reverberate through time, a moment that reminded everyone that even those denied a voice could shape the course of history. Yet Hannah did not celebrate in solitude. She was haunted by the faces of the afflicted, the cries of children, the agonized expressions of those who had once wielded power without consequence. Her act, while precise and deliberate, had left an indelible mark on her conscience. she walked, the thin line between justice and guilt, understanding that the very act that granted her a sense of agency also carried with it a weight that could never be lifted. And in that understanding lay the paradox of her life. She was both empowered and burdened, liberated and constrained by the consequences of a single decisive act. In the years that followed, the story of the McAllister wedding spread far beyond Charleston, entering the realm of folklore, moral lesson, and whispered cautionary tale. Plantation owners, servants, and townspeople alike repeated the story in hushed tones, each recounting colored by fear, awe, and fascination. The tale became a lesson on vigilance, humility, and the fragile nature of assumed superiority. Those who wielded authority came to understand, however reluctantly, that their control was never absolute, and that the unseen hands of those they considered invisible could one day alter the course of their lives in unimaginable ways. Hannah herself became a figure of quiet legend within the estate. To the McAllisters, she was indispensable, her skill unmatched, her loyalty unquestioned. To the surrounding community, she was a shadow, a presence at the heart of a mystery no one could fully comprehend. And to herself, she was a survivor, a woman who had endured, who had observed, who had acted when the moment demanded courage, precision, and patience. She had rewritten the rules of engagement in a world that had consistently sought to silence her, proving that knowledge, cunning, and will could become instruments of justice, even in the smallest, most overlooked hands. Ultimately, the McAllister estate bore witness to a lesson both cruel and instructive: that the illusion of control can fracture in an instant, that power exercised without awareness of those it governs is precarious, and that history, no matter how entrenched or rigid, can be reshaped by the quiet, determined actions of the overlooked. Hannah continued her life, carrying the weight of that day with dignity and careful composure, embodying a truth that would echo long after the echoes of screams had faded, that justice, patience, and courage could converge to rewrite the story of the oppressed, leaving a mark that even the most powerful could not erase. And so the estate remained, the house itself a witness to the chilling, unforgettable events of that wedding day. The oaks and magnolias stood tall, their branches whispering in the wind, carrying secrets of a day when joy had turned to horror, when privilege had met the quiet, unassailable force of someone who refused to remain invisible any longer. It was a story of power, of vengeance, of patience, and of the enduring, unpredictable ways in which justice can manifest, etched forever in the history of Charleston, and remembered in the shadows of those who lived through it, and in the quiet dignity of the cook who had dared to act.